Hello, everyone, and welcome to the JCC of Metro Detroit's 2021 Lenore Marwell Detroit Jewish Film Festival. My name's Jamie Loeb, and I'm the Senior Director of Cultural Arts here at the JCC. It is my pleasure to welcome you on this Thursday evening, May 20th. I do want to remind you that this this talk will remain available on our YouTube channel right here at this same link. So if you have friends that aren't able to watch this evening, feel free to share it with them. It will still be available for viewing. While you're here at our YouTube channel, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the reminder bell so that you never miss one of our exciting events. The Detroit Jewish Film Festival celebrates the art of Jewish filmmaking by presenting films, encouraging discussion about Jewish stories, and creating shared experiences with filmmakers and audiences around the world. The festival runs until this Sunday, May 23rd, and there is still time to watch some films. For all of the details, you can head on over to our website, culturalarts.jccdet.org/filmfest. That's where you can get tickets to films and find out about all of the exciting things we have going on. Before we dive into tonight's event, I want to extend my deepest gratitude to the Film Festival Committee, which is led by our chair, Eric Lumberg. It has, of course, been a challenging and exceptional year, but our committee has really shown dedication and love for the film festival, and it is them that make this festival possible. So thank you. We have a really exciting discussion planned for you, of course, and as always, we want to hear your comments, your questions, and what you're thinking. You can put your thoughts in the comment section below if you're watching on YouTube, or if you're on your TV, you can text this number, 248-973-7286, and we will get to your questions as best we can. So tonight, we are talking about the film Maverick Modigliani and the artist that the documentary brings to life, Amedeo Modigliani. I personally want to know how he got that first name. So we are very excited to have with us Judith Dolkart from the DIA, the Detroit Institute of Arts, which is our presenting partner for this festival, and Dr. Kenneth Wayne from the Modigliani Project. Judith is a deputy director of the DIA who oversees curatorial and learning and audience engagement divisions. Dr. Wayne is the founder and director of the Modigliani Project, which researches Modigliani's life and work and does a lot of work authenticating Modigliani's works, paintings, sculptures, because he is one of the most forged artists in the world. So please join me in welcoming Judith Dolkart and Kenneth Wayne. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thanks, Jamie. We're really excited to be here on the occasion of the film festival. Thanks to all who tuned in. And I'm especially grateful to be joined today by my friend and colleague, Dr. Kenneth Wayne, with whom I've had the opportunity to work in the past. And in addition to his Modigliani project, he curated an exhibition at the Albright Knox called Modigliani and the Artists of Montparnasse, which was magnificent show, terrific catalog. And I think, Ken, we will just start at the beginning and if Jamie could bring up the first slide, and actually maybe the second, where Modigliani got his start.
Okay, yes. So he is from the town of Livorno, which is about 2/3 the way up there. Well, it's even with the top of Elba. Yes, right around there. You can almost, yes, right there on the coast. It's a coastal town and on the Mediterranean. And a very cosmopolitan town. I visited, and there's a lot of the flavor of the Mediterranean. I went to the open market, and there are elements there from Egypt and Greece, various objects that were being sold. And so, very pleasant climate in that area. It's part of Tuscany, not too far from Florence, where Modigliani, one of the places where Modigliani studied. And it's also very close to Carrara, which is where there are marble quarries, which is where Michelangelo obtained his marble for David, the sculpture, and other things. And we know that Modigliani went to Carrara, and we believe he certainly inspired by Michelangelo as an artist. So Michelangelo was a painter and a sculptor and a draftsman and a poet, and those all apply to Modigliani as well. So so he had a rich tradition, history on which he was building on, referring to, and you can see various visual references in his art to Michelangelo. I'll point those out as we go along.
Could we have the next slide, please? One of the things in the film that was discussed was a little bit about the geography or the layout of Livorno, which is something like Venice, which perhaps you could dive into a little bit further, but also the sort of unique position of Jews in Livorno historically. So Ken, would you like to expand on that a little bit?
Sure. Livorno was a very important Jewish center. So it probably, I believe it was the second largest concentration of Jews in Italy after Rome. And it's very important in Jewish history. There was a rabbi there who's quite renowned and had spent his career there, named Ben Zamog. And he was actually Modigliani's, he oversaw Modigliani's bar mitzvah. I mention that because he was an intellectual and a thinker and a writer. So a book came out recently all about about him, and it's important for understanding. I think he influenced Modigliani's thinking as well. Livorno, as you can see here, as I said, it's on the coast, and also importantly, it has canals. So like Venice, in fact, it was modeled on Venice, as we learned in this film. Because Venice had been founded like 700-800 years earlier, and then Livorno was founded basically by the Medici, and they consciously modeled it on Venice. In fact, one of the images that I came across of Livorno, the title was Little Venice. And so important to know. Livorno, unlike Venice, though, did not have a ghetto. So ghetto, which is used quite commonly today, was an Italian word. And we think it probably came from the word borghetto. And and Venice had the most famous ghetto, which you can still see today, where Jews were kept in the ghetto, and there was actually a gate that was locked by key at night. There was a curfew for Jews there. But in Livorno, thanks to the Medici, it was kind of a free port, and it was Jews could live there. They encouraged Jews to move there after the Inquisition in Spain. And Modigliani's family had been in Spain. They were a Sephardic family, and at some point they made their way to Livorno, and so it became an important center for the study, actually, like of the Kabbalah. It was renowned for the study of the Kabbalah, which we know Modigliani was familiar with. He makes, actually in a few drawings, he makes reference to the Kabbalah. And so it had a rich history, Jewish history. And then also, like I said, being part of Tuscany also was part of this larger artistic history in the history of art.
Can we have the next slide, Jamie?
So this, it doesn't look very glamorous, I know, but this is a photo of the house where Modigliani lived. and where he was born, in fact. So when I visited, well, I was able to enter, but by appointment. I think it's more formal. It's more, it's easier to visit today. I think there's kind of a Modigliani Center there. You can see that there's a plaque which would refer to him, but also there are plaques on other buildings in town, and they don't just refer to Amedeo, but also his brother was very famous. So Giuseppe Emanuele, he was a politician. He was actually head of the Socialist Party and the nemesis of Mussolini. So some of these plaques say Giuseppe Emanuele Modigliani lived here and not Amedeo. So Modigliani died, Amedeo, at age 35. His brother lived a full life. He also published prolifically articles, books, and so he is also well known in Italy. So when you mention in Italy the name Modigliani, you have to specify which Modigliani you're referring to.
And next slide, please, Jamie.
This is the synagogue of Livorno, was the synagogue of Livorno, I should say. It no longer exists, unfortunately. It was destroyed during World War II. It was all wood, but this is where Modigliani had his bar mitzvah. So so that would have been, you know, in the 1890s. And so this is a woodcut of the synagogue. So at least we have an image of what it looked like, quite large, as you can see. And so it was, yeah, the second largest in Europe after Amsterdam's. So it was, like I said, a major Jewish center, Livorno was.
And we'll take the next slide. So we're going to rapidly move on to Paris, where Modigliani really spent his career. And, you know, Ken, can you, I think probably many people will know, but what would have drawn him to Paris?
Well, Paris was becoming an important center for artists as a place to exhibit. There was there were different venues in Paris, and artists always want their work to be seen. So there was the Salon d'Automne, Salon des Indépendants. There were galleries that exhibited art, and there were different artist communities, Cité Falguière, and other kind of almost like dormitories. So there was the Bateau Lavoir where Picasso was, and so artists could live together and you know, gain inspiration from each other. At a certain point, the Montparnasse area became the artist center, and so which still exists in Montparnasse. And there, at the intersection of known as the Carrefour Vavin, you had this Café du Dôme, and there was also the Café de la Rotonde, and facing each other. And both of those cafes still exist today. So you can sit on the terrace as Modigliani did. And he had a studio nearby, but sometimes he would sit here at the cafe and we'd make drawings. He would do it on commission. People asked him. And the cafes were very important from a sociological standpoint, in that it wasn't just a place to have a coffee and a beer, but also it was their office. It was literally their office. That's where they would meet models. That's where they would meet their dealers to discuss plans and contracts. And also, because not everyone could afford a phone yet, it was still like a new thing, telephones. So artists would sometimes receive phone calls and messages at these cafes, and then they would be pinned to a board. And that's also where artists sometimes received mail, because they moved frequently. And so, again, there was a board, and if they received a letter, it would be pinned to the board. And So these cafes were very important in the development of modern art. So and these artists, they came from all over the world, very international. That was one of the hallmarks of Montparnasse, was that it was very international. And and that attracted artists, and that so that helped in the development of modern art. And whereas, like with academic artists, it was much more formal. There was the École des Beaux-Arts, and artists studied there, and they didn't. They weren't necessarily part of these social circles in Montparnasse. Let me just say quickly that Montparnasse, the name is a little bit of an inside joke, in that it means Montparnassus, but when you go to Montparnasse, you'll see that it's one of the flattest areas in Paris, which was very helpful to sculptors. They had been up in Montmartre, which is very steep, so there were artist studios up there, but it was, quite arduous for artists, even painters, getting up and down and moving their materials all around, but particularly for sculptors. And Modigliani was a painter and a sculptor and a draftsman. So Montparnasse, it developed its own identity. There was a periodical called Montparnasse, which had like a newsletter, and so those copies are very rare today. But it's finding them is good to see about how things operated at the time.
So Ken, just to talk a little bit, when Modigliani would have arrived in Paris, he was like 21, right? Or in his early 20s?
Yes. And 22, yeah.
And when he first came to Paris, he did go to Montmartre as opposed to Montparnasse. But Montmartre was sort of village-like and a little bit old-fashioned. Montparnasse was really had sort of taken over as the gathering place, and was a little bit more advanced in terms of the artists doing more daring things there. Did Modigliani? Now, I believe he studied for a period of time at one of these sort of independent academies, Colarossi. Can you say anything about that?
Sure. He studied at these independent. He was a student his whole life, in a sense. He studied the different academies, and one big advantage of these places, they had sessions for drawing models. So they would hire models, and then artists would pay a fee and then come in and make drawings and sometimes paintings there. There were numerous academies in Montparnasse. The main aspect of these academies is that they catered to foreigners. So the École des Beaux-Arts was there were accusations of xenophobia, of an active dislike of foreigners, and certain scholarships and money were not available to foreigners. They were only available to French people. And so that kind of drove these foreign artists to these independent academies, which were much more accommodating to them. So you had, in these academies, you had Italians, you had Americans, you had Japanese, and there are records that still exist. Some of these academies still exist today. Académie de la Grande Chaumière, which was on this little street called Rue de la Grande Chaumière, which Modigliani had a studio on that street. And so it would be around the corner from the Dome. So that's where he lived. And in fact, I mentioned that Carrefour Vavin, within 50 yards of the Carrefour Vavin, you had all these artist studios, and you had this congregation of artists, of Picasso and Mondrian and Diego Rivera and the Italian Modigliani. And so it was really an international melting pot there in Montparnasse, and right around the corner from the Dome. So, and
to that point, can we have the next slide, Jamie? So this is a little, why don't you explain, Ken, what we're seeing? And this will even have a Detroit connection. So go ahead.
So this is a caricature, I guess you could say, a later drawing that has Diego Rivera on the left and Modigliani in the middle, and then Ilya Ehrenberg, a Russian poet, on the right. And so I use this to illustrate a point that Marcel Duchamp made. He said this was the first really international group of artists we ever had. So that was kind of the hallmarks of this group, that it was very international. In fact, what we call today modern art, at the time in periodicals, they sometimes called international art. And so that the art that was being made was meant to appeal to a broader audience. Whereas with the academic artists, there was a premium put on French artists gaining inspiration from previous French artists. And they would win medals for how much they based their art on the art of previous French artists. So, so in any case, this was a different mindset for artists, and so they were deriving lessons from. They were looking at a wide variety of sources, and we'll see shortly. So from different countries, different cultures, from Africa, from Egypt, from Cambodia, and so it was an opening up of art and how art was made, and
I particularly love this because, of course, Diego Rivera and Detroiters will know well the beloved Detroit industry murals at the DIA, of course, done by Rivera. So it's nice to see Rivera and Modigliani within this space as well as under the roof of the DIA. I just want to mention Ilya Ehrenberg here for a moment, the poet, because he was someone who remarked upon Modigliani's erudition and his great knowledge of poetry, classical poetry or the work of Dante. But then also he was very much aware of and friends with his contemporaries who are poets, people like Max Jacob, which, if we could have the next slide, please. And sorry, so here again, here are others of that sort of international coterie of artists, many of whom came from Eastern Europe, including Lipschitz and Soutine. Would you like to dive in here about who these artists were and their relevance to Modigliani?
Sure, these were two of Modigliani's closest friends. So Jacques Lipschitz, sculptor, Cubist sculptor, and he lived a long and full life and made sculpture up into the 1970s. Soutine was probably his closest friend, and so he was a painter and who made very interesting expressionistic work, which really had an influence on subsequent artists. He made painted sides of beef, and very painterly, very expressionist works, which influenced de Kooning, it's been said, and among others. And so he was a very important Russian Jewish artist. And so, in fact, Modigliani once said, he said, near the end of his life, I'm leaving you Soutine. He said, as his health was declining, he said, yes, but you will have Soutine. So as kind of to carry on.
So you've included in this image a Fong mask that was from the X collection or the former collection of Vlaminck and Derain. Can you say a little bit more? And you alluded early on about the influences or the interest in African art, Cambodian art, all of these disparate traditions that were visible in artist studios, in the galleries of dealers, and in museums like the Trocadero. Can you talk a little bit about that and Modigliani's interest in them? And also, just to connect back to the rabbi that you mentioned earlier, his sort of universalism.
Right. So he had this broad view. And I thought that this mask, which he probably would have seen in the collection of Vlaminck, then it was in the collection of Derain. But you can see how such art influenced Modigliani. You see the little beady eyes in the mask and in Lipschitz, the long nose, the button mouth, the arched eyebrows. These are all elements that he took from African art. The long neck, that's something from African masks. And he borrowed these elements to basically add an air of mystery to his art. He wanted to not abandon the Western portrait tradition, but he wanted to enliven it by injecting elements from these other cultures. And that's part of his greatness, is that he took elements and then appropriated them and made them his own. And they became signature elements in his own art.
And we'll take the next slide, Jamie, please. And so here, another Fong mask, and two important figures who were very figures who were very critical to Modigliani's fortunes in terms of his becoming better known, and in terms of, I would imagine, his financial fortunes. So could you speak about Paul Alexandre and Paul Guillaume?
Sure, the two Pauls. So yes, so Paul Alexandre was a doctor, a medical doctor, and lover of art. And he discovered Modigliani at one of these salons where you would have where hundreds of artists, thousands of artists exhibited. And in the catalog, you would have the name of the artist and the list of works that they exhibited. And it would also have their address. So if someone liked what they saw, they would then go to the artist studio and buy their work. And Dr. Paul Alexandre was one of those people who liked what he saw at the Salon. I think it was the Val Salon in 1907, and then went to visit Modigliani, and he ended up commissioning paintings from Modigliani of himself and of his family members. And he also bought drawings, a large number of drawings from Modigliani. And so these have become very important. So because there is this problem of fakes that Judith referred to, drawings, Paul Alexandre ended up acquiring almost 500 drawings by Modigliani, and his son, who became an historian, then cataloged the whole collection, and he stamped and numbered the drawings. And so we know exactly which ones were in his father's collection. And he did that basically for posterity and to help the Modigliani field. So when you'll see at auction, some of these drawings have come up at auction. Actually, most of them remained and still remain in the Paul Alexandre family. Now they're a bit dispersed because they were with kids and then now grandkids. But I would say maybe, let's see, of the 500, not even, I think 100 have gone into the marketplace. And so you'll see drawings with this little red stamp, Dr. P.A., and then there'll be a number. So it means from the collection of Dr. Paul Alexandre, and it was cataloged as number 212 or whatever. And so those are drawings which we can reliably count on as being authentic because they've been chronicled. And there was an exhibition in the 90s. This son, Noel Alexandre, he was involved in that. And there was a big fat catalog produced of all of the drawings that his father owned by Modigliani. And so those are cherished works in the Modigliani field. So Paul Alexander, he was not a wealthy man. He had just gotten out of medical school, but he had this love of art, and specifically of Modigliani. They spent a lot of time together before World War I. They would go to art openings and exhibitions together, and so it was a very important friendship. He he had planned to write his own book on Modigliani. So he did not agree to interviews. Various people wanted to interview him about his relationship with Modigliani, and he said, no, it'll all be in my book. And then he lived his life and didn't end up writing that book. And so, which is unfortunate, incredibly unfortunate. But his son, again, who was an historian, he remembered all these stories that his father told him. And so he put those in this book in the 1990s, 1992, 93, called Secret Modigliani, or The Unknown Modigliani. And so even though it's secondhand, these stories are very important, because his father said that he went to this exhibition at this gallery and to that exhibition. And so we know what Modigliani was looking at and what inspired him. Paul Guillaume, fascinating figure. He was younger than Modigliani, and he was a dealer and very precocious and very ambitious. I say, if I were to meet a few people from his circle, Paul Guillaume would definitely be one of them that I would want to meet. So he was very devoted to Modigliani. So he was his first major dealer, and he also represented Picasso and Matisse. So as a 24-year-old, so he had an eye and was very knowledgeable. And Modigliani portrayed him, I think, 6 times. They're in paintings, and so his relationship with Paul Guillaume was quite important. Paul Guillaume wrote various. He didn't write a book about Modigliani, but he did reproduce some of the letters that he had, and he had his own journal called Les Arts à Paris, and there are lots of references to Modigliani in there. So Guillaume, as I said, was ambitious. I think Modigliani was very ambitious. There were references to, there was a major biography done in the 60s on Modigliani, and by a man named Pierre Seychelles, and that's still, some 60 years later, is still a very key book in the Modigliani field. So,
sorry.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to interject about Paul Guillaume, because prior to coming to Detroit, I worked for several years at the Barnes Foundation in Philadelphia. Barnes was a collector, created a foundation that was an educational institution, and Modigliani was one of the key artists in that collection. And he acquired quite a lot from Paul Guillaume as well, who also sold works by Soutine and Lipschitz, some of the other artists that Ken spoke about. And in the case of Barnes, he bought his entire collection of African art, which was, fairly considerable number, all from Guillaume, who would have had in his gallery works of African art that certainly Modigliani would have seen. And so I don't know if you want to expand on that and the other kinds of things that Paul Guillaume was engaged in. And I'll just say that Barnes himself wrote a couple of essays for the art set of Paris, Paul Guillaume's journal. So it's interesting to see how Paul Guillaume drew a number of people to him as sort of the dealer of the 20s, who was working with all of these expatriate artists who were who were working in Paris. There's a viewer's question. It says, are there works by Modigliani at the DIA? And indeed, there are a handful. There are works attributed to Modigliani. There's a drawing and a handful of paintings as well. So I hope you will, if you're out there, you'll come and see them in the modern galleries.
Right. So, yes, so Guillaume, as I said, he was a very precocious figure. When he was still a teenager, before he even became a dealer, he reached out to certain people who he could tell were big names in the field, one being Picasso. So he reached out to Picasso very early on, and he also to the poet Guillaume Apollinaire. So there's important correspondence between Guillaume and Paul Guillaume and Guillaume Apollinaire. So Paul Guillaume was also instrumental in helping Modigliani exhibit both in Paris and then also internationally. In fact, during the World War I, there was an exhibition in New York that featured Modigliani and Brancusi and a couple of other artists, and Paul Guillaume was the one who arranged that. Obviously, it would have been very difficult during the war to transport these works and get them over to the United States. But so there were Modigliani paintings, a couple sculptures, and some drawings. And so Guillaume was important from that standpoint. So Modigliani, this book by Pierre Sichel that I was referring to, it's outstanding. But he did say that Modigliani didn't exhibit much, which is not true. So we found he exhibited during his lifetime at least 18 times. He was in group shows and in Zurich, in London, in New York, in Paris. And that's how an artist, becomes known, is by exhibiting their work. So he was instrumental in doing that.
Jamie, can we have the next slide? And here is Max Jacob, the poet, and Jean Cocteau, also a poet, and then a mask from the Congo.
Right, and you can see in these two portraits, which would be considered kind of cubistic, and you can see that he was inspired by African masks with the nose and the mouth for both of these portraits, and Modigliani was considered to be kind of on the fringes of the Cubist movement because he was close friends with Picasso. So it was mostly through friendship, but also in paintings like these where there are very sharp angular features which are shared with Cubist paintings. And
I would say even sort of the palette, certainly of early Cubism, the analytic Cubism, the sort of
colors and
the grays, the really neutral colors, and the shallow background. That there's certainly in the portrait of Max Jacob, this very shallow background without depth, and it's really just the figure himself who gives any sense of depth.
Right, and as Judith was mentioning, so this reinforces the idea that Modigliani was a very cultured person. He was very knowledgeable about poetry, and here are these two people from his generation with whom he was close who were poets, Max Jacob and Jean Cocteau.
Next, could we have the next slide, Jamie? So moving into the role of women in his works, both as muses and interlocutors, intellectual counterparts. Why don't you? It would be great to hear a little bit about these two portraits and some to come.
Right. So with these, you can see he did become quite a good colorist, as you can see in these paintings. They're with oranges and lime green on the right, and he was a great colorist after he kind of passed through his Cubist phase. So many artists passed through Cubism en route to making their own styles. And one could say that Modigliani was one of those artists. And so on the left, it was Germaine Sauvage was she was married to Leopold Sauvage, who was an artist. So part of this group at the time. On the right, the Italian woman. Both of these paintings probably were painted in the south of France. During World War I, to escape the bombing, Modigliani went down to Nice, and his palette lightened and brightened, and some of his best paintings were created down there. So he's kind of become known as the quintessential painter of women. He clearly had a touch in his paintings of women, and there's in terms of appeal, the Modigliani's art, the #1 category for museums and for collectors is are nudes. We'll see a few of those in a moment, and those have sold for enormous sums of money. One sold for $172 million. That it was in the last 10 years, and so that's the most kind of coveted category. Then there are portraits of women like these two, and then portraits of children. He had a special place in his heart for children, and he ennobled them. He put them on a very grand scale and gave them a lot of dignity and presence. And so he's also known for these portraits, which are very poignant. And so we'll see those, a few of those. And then the category which is least coveted, but are still great, are his portraits of men. So he did paint men, his friends, Lipschitz and others. But in terms of from a collecting standpoint, and when you see at auction, Modigliani paintings, even though Modigliani wasn't super prolific, he made, well, there are 337, which are cataloged in the leading catalog raisonné of his art. But we think that he painted up to about 400 paintings during his lifetime. Picasso, who lived a full life into his 90s, he painted thousands and thousands of works. So, but
like 10,000 or some huge number.
Exactly. So
yeah. I mean, so an artist like Cezanne is a couple thousand, just for sort of relevance, or to put it in comparison. Can we have the next slide?
So right. So here are the nudes. It's the famous nudes, which are those are the ones that. They're great. All of his art is great, but these the nudes are really
famous or infamous, even.
Exactly. Yeah, both of them. So he had one-person show during his lifetime, and there were nudes featured in the window of the exhibition, and the exhibition was in a gallery. Berthe Weil was one of the few female dealers at the time, very important. She was the first to exhibit Picasso, and she also had this one-person show for Modigliani. So because of the nudes in the window and the fact that the gallery was directly across the street from a police station, the show was closed down on opening night. But we can tell from reviews that the show continued. That was kind of a hiccup with the seizure on the first day. Just they took the nudes out of the window because it was a little bit too provocative. But that's the thing. So Modigliani became known as one of the painters of nudes par excellence. What made them so controversial is the fact that they were so contemporary. So these are not figures wearing togas or placed in some distant historical Grecian time, but they are from today. So the first artist to do that just before Modigliani's generation was Manet. And then, but Modigliani, who made some 36 nudes. Really, that became a signature part of his art, were his nudes. So the one on the right, it's one of my favorites. Well, they're all favorites. The one on the right is in Honolulu, at the Honolulu Academy of Art. And the colors, they're just so, such beautiful colors, pinks and oranges. And the background is kind of a lavender gray. And so he really knew how to present colors, and he would use contrasting complementaries to make colors pop. So he had various tricks and techniques. There's great luminosity to his paintings. He had a special way of having that come through. And
Ken, we're going to talk about him as a sculptor, and the traces that he left as a sculptor. But one of the things that I have always found about Modigliani, and this is true of a number of painters, but because his touch is so visible in his work, and certainly in the background of the work that you see on the right, he's always telling you he's a painter. He's always leaving his mark to, in a way that declares, I'm a painter, or the same with his sculpture, I'm a sculptor. That he doesn't try to hide what he's doing. He's leaving it bare and kind of showing you his work.
Right, very painterly. The brush strokes are very important. And so, yes, he was aware of his craft. I have to say, one of the exciting things happening in the Modigliani field now is that there's been a lot of technical research being done on Modigliani, and what makes a Modigliani. And so they study how he applied his paint and what grounds he used, and these are so that's the Burlington magazine had a series of 6 articles, and where they take a close look at how he constructed his work. And so this information is very valuable and important to me when I'm verifying a painting. So because as I mentioned, they're in the current catalog resume, there are 337, but we think that he painted up to 400. And even so, in the field, everyone agrees that there are more than 337. And even the man who made that catalog said that there were more to be found. And so it's exciting to verify these paintings. So I mean, he's passed away, and he's not going to make any more, but at least we can add works to the canon or to his overall of works that would then be used in exhibitions and in publications. So I just wanted to say before we move on from these, I'm often asked, where would Modigliani have gone if he had continued to live? Artistically, where would he have gone? And I think that he would have moved into surrealism. And you can see here with these 2 figures on the left, they've got their eyes closed. I think there's kind of a proto-surrealist aspect to many of Modigliani's works, and these 2 in particular with the closed eyes, they're in a dream state. And so that's what I think of, one of the things I think of when I look at these 2 paintings. So
could we have the next slide, Jamie? So this is one of my favorite figures in the career of Modigliani. This is Beatrice Hastings, which was a pseudonym. She had a sort of very exciting, adventurous life. She was purportedly married to a prize fighter from whom she got the name Hastings. But she spent a number of years in Paris, and she wrote a series of articles called Impressions of Paris under yet a different pseudonym, Alice Morning. It was and she wrote them for a British weekly called The New Age. And it was interesting because she talks about Modigliani. She writes about him. She says, he was the spoiled child of the quarter, enfant sometimes terrible, but always forgiven. Which is, very sort of interesting, and reveals the personal nature of their relationship. And then she wrote a surrealist novella, which was never published, called Minnie Pinnikin. And he appears there also as a character. Do you want to say anything else about their relationship?
Yes, there's so much to say about her. I think she was one of the very key figures in his life, because he was with her from 1914 to 1916, which are the very years when his signature style developed. The long necks, the great love of African art. And so, yes, she was she was an intellectual. And I think they had an intense relationship and had some incredible discussions. And so I've written on her, which has been great fun. And so she was a journalist. She wrote short stories. She was quite prolific, actually. And so her work is just starting to get a lot of attention in recent years. And but I think she is someone who has to be taken very seriously when studying Modigliani. So she was one of the key loves of his life. He painted a number of portraits of her. So I think 14 or more. And so one sees portraits of her as like a whole category of his art. So she wrote so we wonder what the nature of their conversations, but she wrote this novella called Minnie Pinnikin, and which was really a story of their love affair. And it's particularly important because it was written during their relationship, not 50 years later. And so it had been known, and then it was lost for a long period of time. And just to brag a little bit, actually, I'm the one who found it. So I knew of its existence, Minnie Pinnikin. And so I had been looking for it and asking everyone, over the years if they had any traces of it. And there hadn't been, generally. And then I was looking actually at the museum, of all places. I didn't find it like in a Montparnasse, in a cafe or in an attic in France or some regional library. I found it at the Museum of Modern Art. So I had seen a reference. There had been an exhibition in the 1950s by a curator named William Lieberman, and he had interviewed the executor of Beatrice Hastings' estate, like in the 1940s, and she had given him a copy of Minnie Pinnikin. It's sort of like, oh, here, why don't you take this? And so when I was looking at his materials, probably the only person in the history who's looked at the archival material of this curator, just to see, because when he did his exhibition, exhibition catalogs were very thin. So I thought, well, maybe there's some really interesting material in there that was not referenced in his exhibition. And I saw on the finding aid, it said Minnie Pinnikin. And I literally jumped out of my seat and I said, oh my God, is this finally, if I found a copy of Minnie Pinnikin? And so his materials were in off-site storage in upstate New York. And so it referred to Minnie Pinnikin, and then I think it said, there was some reference to the number of pages, and it wasn't very many. And I thought, well, I'll take a look at it anyway. And so I requested it, and the librarian brought out this thick file of of pages. And there it's like 52 pages long. And it was this story that she wrote. And so she was Minnie Pinnikin. And then she had a pet name for Modigliani, Patrodor. I don't know what that comes from. and it was very surrealistic, and it definitely gave the impression that they were either drunk or high or something. And it talked about like skipping from rooftop to rooftop, and there were a lot of interesting references in Minnie Pinnikin. So in fact, so I reproduced Minnie Pinnikin as an appendix in this catalog that I did, this exhibition catalog on Modigliani.
So can we have just 5 minutes left? But I'd love to actually, if we could skip ahead to the sculpture, because it's such an important part of his work. And
right, can we go back just to the? Well, I mentioned the okay. Here is Paulette Jourdan. It's probably the last portrait that he painted, or one of the last two portraits he painted. So she was a child. We had just seen before children that we painted. And when I was living in Paris and doing research, she was still alive all these years later. And so I interviewed her. But Paulette, and this portrait actually recently came up at auction a few years ago at Sotheby's. And I had interviewed her and recorded it on tape, my interview with her, and wrote the entry, the auction catalog entry on her. So she had lots of interesting things to say. She said that he loved going to the Louvre, that his favorite painting was the Mona Lisa. And I think that's very telling. I think, Mona Lisa is known for having an enigmatic quality. And I think in a lot of portraits by Modigliani, there's an enigmatic quality. And so it's not surprising that he was inspired by Leonardo and specifically by the Mona Lisa.
Well, and so actually that's a great segue in some ways to the sculpture and almost back to origins. So if we could have the next slide, because, as you say, he was very erudite. He was certainly schooled on the Italian Renaissance, and Michelangelo, he sort of saw himself originally as a sculptor and bought Carrara marbles. These sculptures, which, are mostly done from limestone, which he found or misappropriated in Paris. But here too, I just want to go back to both Leonardo and Michelangelo, certainly with the central figure. And I wonder if we have 3 minutes left, if you'd say a little bit about the sculpture.
Right. So he was a great sculptor. He made about 27 sculptures, or about 27, I should say, survive. And they're just stellar. They're really exquisite. They're made of limestone, and what that means is that limestone has some kind of reflective qualities that, as the light changes, the surface changes on them. And all of the sculptures are different. The one in the middle, I think, is an absolute reference to Michelangelo and his slaves. Which, if you visited the David in Florence, in the vestibule leading up to the David are these sculptures by Michelangelo and of slaves. They're all unfinished and they're kind of emerging from the stone. And I think that's a quality in this central sculpture, that this face is kind of breaking out of the limestone, and you can see that the chisel marks in the limestone. So it's still, it may be finished. It has kind of an unfinished look or quality to it. But I think that was an intentional direct reference to Michelangelo, and who I think was certainly an inspiration to him.
And I just want to add one of my favorite quotes about the sculpture comes from another sculptor, Epstein, Jacob Epstein, who remarked that Modigliani would put candles on the top of the sculpture so that there would be this flickering candlelight, which would bring out all of the qualities of the touch, again, that you see, that the traces of sculpting left behind by the chisel. And you would certainly have seen that in the center work, and would bring it back to the example of Michelangelo that you're remarking upon in those slaves in Florence. It's an amazing how he layered so many references onto his works, whether it was African art, Cambodian sculpture, potentially oceanic material, and then of course the classical references of his native Italy. We have 23 seconds left. Any last words, Ken?
Well, right. He organized these in his studio in a circle, and yes, put candles on top of them. And he had an interest in creating a temple of beauty. And so that's kind of what he was constructing in his studio. And so, right, there are so many different references. And that's why I love his work and keep going back to it, is because I always find new things in there. I see Leonardo, I see Michelangelo, I see African art, I see Gauguin, I see Picasso, I see Toulouse-Lautrec, so he took all of these different inspirations and assimilated them and made his own unique style.
Well, thank you, Ken, for joining us tonight from your home and for Detroit audiences. And thank you all for joining us this evening.
And thank you to Judith. Thank you to Ken. Thank you to those of you at home watching. This has been a really, really interesting discussion and one of my favorite artists. So always a good time. I do want to let you all know that our final film festival event of the year is on Sunday, May 23rd at 7 p.m., not 7 a.m., 7 p.m. We have very special guests with us joining us on Sunday, Amy Irving and Carol Kane, and they will both be here to talk about the life and the legacy of director Joan Micklin Silver, who passed away this past winter. So I hope you'll be able to join us for that really exciting event. And until then, have a great night.